If you feel like the world is sliding toward an endless war between Iran, Israel, and the United States, it is because this conflict has been building for generations, quietly at first, then loudly, and now with a force that feels impossible to stop. In late February 2026, major news outlets reported that Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed during a joint US-Israeli strike, a moment that immediately raised the fear of a wider regional explosion. But even that headline, shocking as it is, does not explain the deeper truth. This is not a brand new war. This is the story of a war that often hides behind other names: sanctions, proxies, covert operations, deterrence, resistance. But the engine behind it has kept running, decade after decade. To understand why the anger is so deep, we have to go back before the Islamic Revolution, to the moment many Iranians still describe as the original wound. In 1953, Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown in a coup backed by the United States and the United Kingdom after he moved to nationalize Iran's oil industry. Years later, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright publicly acknowledged that the United States played a significant role in that overthrow. For many Iranians, that was not ancient history. It became a living lesson. Foreign powers could decide the fate of Iran's government and Iran's resources from the outside. After the coup, the Shah's rule hardened. Iran became a key Western partner during the Cold War, and it built close ties with Washington. At the same time, Iran and Israel, which seems almost unbelievable today, maintained a working relationship in that era because they shared strategic interests in a region dominated by Arab nationalism and rivalry. But underneath that alliance, anger simmered inside Iran, tied to repression, inequality, and the feeling of humiliation. Then came 1979. On February 1st, 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran from exile, landing in Tehran and stepping into history as the revolution reached its point of no return. The Shah's monarchy collapsed soon after, and the Islamic Republic was born, built around a new political theology where ultimate authority sat with a supreme religious leader. This was not just a change of government, it was a change of identity. In the worldview of the new Islamic Republic, the United States and Israel were no longer partners. They were symbols. The United States became the image of foreign control and interference. Israel became, in the regime's framing, the outpost of Western power in the region and the central enemy in the fight over Palestine. And then, only months after the revolution, the rupture became permanent. On November 4th, 1979, Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking American personnel hostage. The crisis lasted 444 days and ended on January 20, 1981. In American memory, it was a national humiliation. In the Islamic Republic's mythology, it became proof that they could stand up to a superpower. From that point forward, mistrust stopped being a feeling and started being policy. Over time, Washington formally designated Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism, a status the U.S. government says Iran has held since 1984. Whether you agree with that label or not, the impact is concrete. It shaped sanctions, diplomacy, and the assumptions each side made about the other's intentions.
But the conflict did not stay contained between capitals. It spread outward, into the region, and it found a new battlefield where deniability could live: Lebanon. On June 6, 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon in what it called Operation Peace for Galilee, aiming to push back the PLO and reshape the security landscape on its border. Iran, meanwhile, was fighting for survival in the Iran-Iraq War, and it could not afford a direct confrontation with Israel, so it leaned into something else: influence through allies. Within weeks of the 1982 invasion, Iran deployed Revolutionary Guard advisors to Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, helping recruit, train, and organize armed groups that evolved into Hezbollah. Hezbollah later issued a manifesto in 1985 laying out its ideology and goals, and over time it grew from an armed resistance movement into a major military and political force in Lebanon. This is where the war learned to speak in code. Instead of Iranian soldiers crossing borders openly, Iran could support partners who fought Israel directly. Instead of Israel striking Iran head-on, it could strike supply lines, commanders, and infrastructure linked to Iranian influence. The US, caught in the middle, became both participant and target. The clearest shock came on October 23, 1983, when truck bombs hit barracks housing US and French forces in Beirut, killing 241 US military personnel and 58 French personnel. Responsibility and attribution have been debated and litigated for decades, but the strategic meaning was unmistakable. A new kind of warfare had arrived, one where alliances, militias, and deniable networks could reshape the region. From there, the conflict matured into a system. Iran developed what analysts often call a proxy strategy, building relationships with armed groups across the region to extend influence and create deterrence beyond its borders. Israel, meanwhile, pursued its own doctrine of striking threats before they could become existential, including covert operations and intelligence campaigns aimed at slowing Iran's military and nuclear capabilities. Then came the nuclear chapter, the one that convinced many people there might still be an exit ramp. In July 2015, Iran and world powers reached the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. But on May 8, 2018, President Donald Trump announced the United States would end its participation and reimpose sanctions. That decision tightened the economic pressure on Iran and deepened the belief inside Tehran that agreements with Washington could be reversed with a single election. And as pressure rose, the shadow war intensified. On January 3, 2020, Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds force, was killed by a U.S. drone strike near Baghdad International Airport, ordered by President Trump. For Washington, it was framed as a defensive action. For Iran, it was an assassination of a national symbol and a strategic mastermind. The region absorbed the message. Escalation could move from proxy networks to direct strikes on leaders. And that brings us back to the present atmosphere, where every retaliation feels like it could be the spark that finally lights the whole room. When you look at this conflict from far away, it can seem like it is only about territory or missiles or politics, but when you zoom in, you see something colder and more permanent: identity, memory, and fear. For the Islamic Republic, resistance is not just a strategy, it is part of how the regime justifies its legitimacy, especially when it faces internal pressure. For Israel, the threat is not theoretical, it is existential, shaped by history and the belief that waiting can be fatal. For the United States, Iran represents both a long-standing adversary and a persistent source of instability that can pull America into war even when it says it does not want one. And now, with reports of leadership decapitation strikes, retaliatory attacks, and renewed regional violence in 2026, the sense of an endless war feels less like a metaphor and more like a warning. But here is the most important truth I can leave you with. This conflict has survived for decades, not because any side is always strong, but because every side believes it cannot afford to look weak. That is how wars become endless. Not with one big decision, but with 1,000 smaller ones that feel unavoidable in the moment. And when the next headline hits, and it will, remember this: it didn't start yesterday. It started with wounds that were never healed, only covered up, and every generation has inherited the anger like a family secret that no one can finally bury.